All right. Good morning, everyone. Before we begin, allow me to introduce myself and Lex Aquatica. My name is Quek from the Lex Aquatica committee. Lex Aquatica is a student-led initiative aimed at disseminating information and stimulating discussion on international and domestic laws related to the marine environment. So as part of Lex Aquatica, we are organizing the Malaysian Marine Environment Policy and Law Review Competition, or in short, MPPLC. Now, I believe most of us have seen the participant call, which was released almost 2 weeks ago. To provide further background and information from the info pack, the committee actually will speak to experts to give us a brief introduction to the topics at hand, the topics that the participants are required to write on. This is in hopes that it will guide participants in finalizing their policy or law review. So I will be the moderator today on today's session on marine policy and law. And we hope to have a very interesting discussion with our speaker, Ms. Shantini Guna Rajan from WWF Malaysia. But enough about me. I'm happy to welcome Ms. Shantini, who will be speaking to us today. This is one of the topics that is related, I think one of the major topics that's related to the MPPLC competition. So, welcome Ms. Shantini. How are you today, Shantini?
Doing great. Thank you, Quek. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. And
Awesome.
I'm sure you're also very eager to present the topic at hand today.
Absolutely.
Yeah, without further ado, let me just pull up the slides and I will give you a cue to start. Give me a second. So the slides are up now. And let me share the sound. Okay. All right.
Are we good, Quek?
Yes, it's just coming up right now. And okay, you can share your video and start presenting.
I'll keep my video till the Q&A, if that's all right. So I'll just start presenting first.
Give me a second, Shantini. It's the PowerPoint is malfunctioning on my side. Let me recording. Okay, so Shantini, your slides are up right now. Okay, we're on the second slide.
Good morning, everyone. This is just a sneak preview into Law and Order, a special edition on Marine Species Victims Unit in Malaysia. Just to set the scene, the sawfish, the demersal fish stocks, dolphins, and turtles. These are either species which are under law of Malaysia deemed to be protected or to be managed or conserved. And yet we have seen stocks decimated over the years. We have seen some of these species being subjected to asphyxiation and also stranding in our waters. Next slide, please. The primary and main legislation framework law that applies in terms of marine conservation or fisheries management is the Fisheries Act of Malaysia. And as you can see that there are key provisions in law which apply to require the conservation and management of fish stocks, to the protection of mammals as well as turtles. But be mindful that this is not the singular piece of legislation that applies for the conservation and management of marine species in Malaysia, but there are other supplementary and significant legislation either at the federal or state levels which apply to the general conservation and protection of the marine environment and species in general. Next, please. So today we would like to just dive a little deeper into the topic of marine environmental governance in Malaysia by providing a broad overview of what's out there, what's the legal framework that governs our marine environment in Malaysia, who are the players, what are the laws and policies that apply, and we will just very quickly look into selected issues afflicting our troubled waters. Next, please. As a general backdrop, there are a list of numerous international conventions and laws which apply in Malaysia, which Malaysia has either ratified or signed on to. And these range from the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, Convention on Biological Diversity, and all these different conventions touch on various thematic areas. But in terms of marine environmental conservation, UNCLOS, or the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, is dubbed to be the Constitution of the Oceans because it provides a framework for the governance of marine environment and marine-based activities. Now, as we know, these conventions do not automatically come into effect in a national circumstance or situation. It has to be given the force of law, power, and so forth within the national jurisdiction. Next, please. So within the Malaysian legal framework, we are all governed primarily by the Federal Constitution of Malaysia, and by virtue of the Constitution and the ninth schedule of which outlines the legislative jurisdiction of the federal government, the state government, and also where both jurisdictions share jurisdiction. As you can see that there are selected topics throughout this table which identifies when the federal government has jurisdiction, and this includes international obligations. However, there are sections in the Constitution which provides that international obligations will need to be transposed within domestic context in consultation with states or so forth. What's notable in this list is that you can see within the federal list, fisheries generally falls under the federal list. Turtles as a marine species is singularly singled out and it's under the state list, and you have the protection of wild animals, which is under the concurrent list, which is shared jurisdiction. You also have topics such as land and forest falling under the state jurisdiction, among others. What this actually translates to mean is, let's look at the picture on the right. It means that turtles and species and ecosystems who knows no political boundary, who knows no federal state delineation, are bound by governance of a legislative framework dubbed by man. Based on the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, it's not just the ninth schedule that comes into play. We also have a zoning system in terms of determining where state waters start, where federal waters start, and what's the extent to which states and federal government have control over the marine environment. States in general adhere to the 3 nautical mile jurisdiction space, and there are laws to dictate how these 3 nautical miles would be drawn up and identified. So 3 nautical miles landwards generally falls under state jurisdiction, 3 nautical miles seawards up to international boundaries or 200 nautical miles generally fall under federal jurisdiction or federal legislation. Next, please. This table seeks to just outline. Now, we heard about UNCLOS being dubbed the Constitution of the Sea, how that has to some extent been transposed in Malaysia is displayed here. On the one hand, we have one international framework that covers topics such as the establishment of maritime zones, looking into environmental protection and preservation. And when I say environmental protection and preservation in this context, I mean it in the broadest sense, which includes pollution control, biodiversity conservation, ecosystem and species level conservation and protection measures. And then we also have fisheries, the use, conservation, and management of living natural resources. There are other thematic areas under UNCLOS which impinge upon navigation, like shipping and also extraction of minerals and so forth in areas beyond national jurisdiction, among others. But for purposes of this, we are looking at largely environmental related themes. Within the Malaysian context, this is a non-exhaustive list, of laws which apply by these thematic scopes. And you can see that within the Malaysian landscape, our legal framework is rather fragmented or thematic, reflecting the ninth schedule of the Federal Constitution to some extent. So since the Constitution does not have environment as a subject matter, we have come to see that environmental protection in federal territory or peninsular Malaysia at least is governed under the Environmental Quality Act, but Sabah and Sarawak have their respective state level legislation. Now we can also see that since wildlife, as it fell under the concurrent jurisdiction, we can also see states like Sabah and Sarawak having their standalone state legislation, but in Peninsular Malaysia, there is a codified Wildlife Conservation Act. So these fragmentations have led to several interesting observations and probably gaps or ambiguities, and this may be discussed later. Lastly, when it comes to fisheries, there is the, once again, singular legal framework, which is the Fisheries Act, so far as it concerns with maritime and estuarine fishing in Malaysia. Do take note that under the Federal Constitution, Sabah and Sarawak can exercise some level of state-level legislative jurisdiction due to special supplementary powers. Next, please. Now, these are some of the institutions that are in Malaysia, and these institutions are non-exhaustive. Once again, we have over 30 departments, agencies overseeing selected thematic issues on ocean and marine environment governance in Malaysia. Next, please. So the question the point that begs the question is, we have all these laws, we have all these policies, we have all these institutions, and yet there's so much trouble at sea. Why? Next, please. Next, please. So the question then comes, is our house in order in terms of governance of marine environment? Here, I'd like to just touch on 3 selected examples of potential issues which gives rise to effective marine environmental governance in Malaysia, just to give you a flavor. First up, next please. Let's look at it from an institutional point of view. Who is the institution that is going to help govern, oversee, coordinate, and charter the path for ocean environment? The fact is, nature abides and adheres to natural laws. They do not need management from human perspective. What is needed is the management, conservation, and the regulation of human conduct within the physical environment, the sphere of physical environment. We need to recognize, we need to adhere to ecological limits and planetary boundaries. In order to do so, we need to have comprehensive understanding of the different myriad of human-based activities, be it shipping, fisheries, extraction of minerals, development, infrastructure, and so forth, and how cumulatively or individually these activities have an impact on the marine environment. In order to do that, there needs to be a focal institution, there needs to be a focal sense of an entity to help charter this, to coordinate this. We have similar entities when it comes to planning for the land and terrestrial related matters, but it is a gap when it comes to oceans. Next, please. Looking at a legal perspective, an example in terms of law. We heard about the state jurisdiction and the federal jurisdiction earlier on. So fisheries in general falls under the federal jurisdiction, but land falls under the state jurisdiction. We also heard that state waters are 3 nautical miles landwards in general. How this can potentially provide conflict in one extent is in the example of fisheries. all of the waters, be it state waters or federal waters, constitute Malaysian fisheries water under the Fisheries Act. And by virtue of this, it's governed under the Fisheries Act of 1985. However, land, which is up to 3 nautical miles, falls under the state jurisdiction. Coastal areas, which includes these waters, this belt of waters up to 3 nautical miles and beyond, are highly important in certain areas for fish productivity, as it usually consists of habitats for fish nurseries and so forth. In the event states decide to reclaim an area, to continue to develop in that area or convert mangroves or seagrass beds, fisheries would be significantly impacted. How can we best address this potential conflict? Next, please. Similarly, within the same context, imagine this creature called coral. A coral is an animal which resides in the benthic ecosystem, namely the seabed. It is neither fish nor land, but it lacks a clear identity or personality under Malaysian law. The two major frameworks, the Fisheries Act and the National Land Code, have therefore displayed definitions, which both are wide enough to encompass corals, noting the fact that Malaysia sits within the Coral Triangle area, which is one of the highest region of coral biodiversity in the world, calling upon communities to come together to conserve, protect, and better manage corals in Malaysia due to the various threats of destructive fishing practices, climate change, pollution, and so forth. Let me put the question to you. Ought corals not be recognized as an animal? Ought it not have its own legal framework for the conservation and protection of it? Next, please. Now we move on to a policy consideration. Just an example. So we have the National Policy in Biological Diversity. We have the much touted Sustainable Development Goals. And largely these goals are key and crucial because it is a point of convergence for nations and within a nation for administrators and stakeholders to come together to agree towards a common end goal or end game. Be mindful also that while we set these goals and targets, more often than not, the goals and targets get pushed back in terms of its goalposts due to implementation gaps and so forth. But in this context, we are looking at achieving a 10% conservation of marine and coastal areas in Malaysia, and this has been agreed upon for within the Malaysian context, a 2025 timeframe at the moment. Of course, at the global level, this is being reviewed, but let's just consider this within a national landscape. We can have this goal, but what then is the policy direction when it comes to the governance of marine and coastal area? Do we have a consistent definition on conservation in Malaysia as far as it concerns marine and coastal environment? The answer is yes and no. So we do have some allusions with respect to what this means, but I will not say it's clear. How this can prove a challenge is when we are trying to achieve these goals. It's not just about achieving the 10%, but it's about understanding the intent behind these goals. So in so doing, we need to ensure that ecosystems that are protected are representative, are of good standing in sense of biodiversity, amongst others. Next, please. So having seen some of the selected considerations, be it institutional, legal, or policy, some way forward that we can consider is A, to keep UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, unclosed and keep it up close. Why do I say that? Several reasons. One, UNCLOS being the Constitution of the Seas has detailed provisions on best standards of management with respect to the ocean environment and also activities within the marine space. Once we have selected national laws, we should not disregard UNCLOS, but we should, in a timely manner, think about reviewing national laws in the light of UNCLOS. Have national laws effectively transpose standards and requirements and provisions within UNCLOS. Second, UNCLOS does not remain closed for the mere reason that laws are not static. They need to be certain, they need to be clear, but they are not static as human activities and parameters continue to shift. Keeping it up close is, again, we have goals such as the Sustainable Development Goals 2030, among others. A closer scrutiny of UNCLOS will enable us to see whether UNCLOS, along with other national policies and laws, can help us achieve set goals under policies, be it national or global commitments. Beyond that, at a broad level, it would be ultimately imperative to identify and establish a national focal institution, a national ocean policy. And this is because for our oceans to exist in a healthy manner, for us as humans to live in harmony with nature, we definitely need a score, a conductor for our oceans. Imagine walking into an orchestra where all instruments and all players are there, but there is no conductor, no score, and everybody is just asked to play a song. You would have 20 different songs and it would be an utter history. So we need better coordination and we need a mechanism in place. Lastly, it's about inculcating a code of living in harmony with nature. We have an excellent point of reference in the Rukun Negara, which have 5 profound principles, beginning with the belief in God, the supremacy of the Constitution, the rule of law, amongst others. How can we better inculcate this? The fact that we have numerous policies, institutions, and laws alone is not sufficient, as evident by the fate of our marine environment today. It also implies that laws may not be effectively implemented, that individuals are not necessarily adhering to guidelines and laws. It also indicates that as custodians of nature, we are not doing what we ought to, or we are not doing enough rather. Next, please. So these are some specific actions that we need to consider. We need to understand very well what gaps persist within our legal and policy framework. And these gaps can range from knowledge gaps, legal gaps, institutional gaps, policy gaps, resource gaps. Understanding these gaps would then require corresponding measures. Are there sufficient enablers to actually fill these gaps? Are there sufficient legal and policy frameworks to guide the future achievement of commitments in terms of conservation of marine environment? Next, please. It is definitely a shared responsibility. There's no single actor. It's not just the government. It's not just the industry. It's not just NGOs. It's everybody. So as students, I absolutely commend the efforts of ecology for this MPPLC competition. And what I'd like to share is what WWF Malaysia is doing in terms of marine conservation against this backdrop of, one, on the left, you see the 3 pillars that we're trying to achieve through our marine program. That is to pursue better habitat conservation, species conservation, and footprint management, which is activities such as fisheries in the last one. On the right side, we have our 10-year strategy, which cuts across various themes ranging from forests to addressing plastic pollution, climate change, conserving coasts and seas, as well as achieving or advocating for sustainable fisheries management. Each of these goals and strategies requires specific policy, legal, and institutional interventions, reforms, but it would require another session altogether. I'm more than happy to chat further on this. But today, the idea and the objective is just to give you a broad overview into some of the topics. Next, please. The very important thing is to never be complacent and to keep questioning. Are laws enough? Are policies developed with the intention of achieving intended outcomes? Are we doing enough? There may be many efforts, there may be a proliferation of policies, but are these actions and policies and laws adding up? Thank you very much. Back to you, Quek.
Thank you, Shantini, for that very insightful presentation. That was a really, really good overview of our policy and legislation with regards to the marine environment. I was particularly interested in the coral dilemma, and I think that's a very, very a useful topic for the participants, as well as looking at the entire policy structure. So thank you so much. Maybe in the next few minutes we are going to have a question and answer session, and I'll start off with the first question, if you don't mind, Shantini. Okay, so the first question goes like this. We have seen laws related to the terrestrial environment being updated regularly, as evidenced by the Wildlife Conservation Act 2010 and National Forestry Act 1984 amendments. Could you update us regarding the situation with marine environment laws? You know, how often are they being updated to suit today's needs?
Thank you very much, Quek, for that question. So that is definitely true that we see a lot of revisions, reviews of terrestrial related laws and policies. As I've mentioned, the primary or the main legal framework when it comes to marine environment is the Fisheries Act at the federal level and the numerous other state legislation. The Fisheries Act in itself definitely requires numerous improvements, and I believe the Department of Fisheries Malaysia is presently reviewing the framework. They have also sent out recently a survey calling for stakeholders to fill in their perspective with respect to the needs of marine protected areas in specific when it comes to the Fisheries Act. So there seems to be effort, but yes, we need more timely review. There needs to be timely review of plans and policies. Just to give you an example, we have numerous national plans of actions for species such as turtles and sharks in Malaysia. We also have national plans of actions applicable for better management of fisheries on topics such as fishing capacity, as well as illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Most, if not all, of this national plan of actions have already surpassed its review time frame, and some of it by more than 5 years. So what are the impediments, or what are the barriers to some of these policies being reviewed in a timely manner? I may not be the best person to answer that question, but we need to consider why these are not happening in a timely manner. On one end, it's also possible because, for example, in the example of turtles fall under the state jurisdiction. Now, when we have a national plan of action, we are looking at national level consensus on interventions. Not all states in Malaysia may have a similar perspective with respect to turtle conservation because the issues may be very localized. Nonetheless, it should not stop us from looking at measures at the national level, which can help improve specific measures. The second framework I'd like to just quickly touch on is the Environmental Quality Act. This is a framework that largely touches on pollution control and regulation of industries. Again, this is undergoing review at the moment, and we are hoping to see stronger marine-specific provisions being included in this framework. Back to you, Quek.
All right. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing those insights. And I do believe that our current marine environment laws can be improved. And I think this debate or this MPPLC will be also a way to communicate that, and also to get the voice of the youth with regards to marine environment laws. Moving on to the second question. I know you touched on this during your presentation. In the federal constitution, several items related to the marine environment are placed in the state list and the concurrent list, and there are many implications of this. Could you highlight to us what is the main real life implication or the main impediment by placing this in the state or the concurrent list? Over to you, Shantini.
Thank you, Quek. In actuality, there ought not be any severe complication. In actuality, through collaboration and cooperation, there can be smooth and effective governance of a marine environment. But in reality, there are challenges, and these ranges from numerous reasons. Firstly, if we look at, I'm just going to touch very quickly on finance. We have a federal state governance system, and this does not just apply in terms of legislative jurisdiction, but also in terms of finance and revenue. Who generates revenue from what? So if federal is entitled to generate revenue from selected thematic areas, it limits states' capacity to generate income from other areas, right? So if as a state, their biggest assets would usually be natural resources and land. So if I'm a state government and I'm presently thinking of generating revenue for my state, I would look towards those two thematic areas. So now as a state, if I want to develop my coastal area, I would look at reclamation, for example, as a way forward to bring in more economic development and socioeconomic benefits for the state. At the same time, fisheries, for example, is important, and it's a responsibility parked under the federal government. And fish is as a subject matter is very important because it addresses the food security considerations of the nation, since we are one of the biggest seafood consuming nations with over 1/3 of our proteins coming from fish protein. Federal government has jurisdiction on fisheries, as I've mentioned earlier. So in an event of conflicting interests, how then best to address this? The complication comes in when A, there isn't enough scientific information that has been produced to be mainstreamed into federal and state policies. Now, if you're looking at environmental sensitive areas, we have the National Physical Plan, which looks into identifying and designating some of these areas, which regulates activities within these areas. You just look at the map within the National Physical Plans, and you can actually see very clearly that there are vast areas in the terrestrial landscape that has been identified as ESAs, but within the marine realm, it's largely limited to protected areas. Recognizing the fact that all of our fisheries waters are production waters, producing fisheries for the nation, should we not look into identifying wider sensitivity areas? And through that mechanism, can it then trickle down towards advising and guiding state use of land and waters within those sensitive areas? So these form of discussions need to happen. These forms of scientific information needs to be developed. These forms of research, which actually happens, need to be funneled into publications, and then funneled into policy statements and documents and plans. Hence, having a coordinating agency entity which brings together the different federal and state entities to identify and agree upon a common way forward is absolutely essential. Back to you.
Yeah, that's a great plan, and I really like the analogy about having a conductor in an orchestra. I think that is spot on in terms of improving the governance of oceans or marine environment in Malaysia. We have time for one last question, and I think this question is asked by many of the participants. Probably you could share insight, or this is probably like soalan bocor or jawapan bocor. If you could change one policy or law related to the marine environment in Malaysia, what would it be and why?
Okay. Yeah, so I tried very carefully to curate issues which were broad, and I didn't touch on any thematic areas because I thought let the students explore the boundaries of environmental law in Malaysia on their own. But since you've put me on the spot, I would say I can't pick one. I have two. But since I've already touched on the national ocean policy and so forth, I still have to. I think we seriously need to review and reform the laws governing our maritime zones to begin with, and what those zones actually mean in terms of scope and also permissible activities. Second is, I think we seriously need to review and reform the legal framework applicable to marine biodiversity and species in Malaysia. These are the two major ones. I've also touched on several fisheries-specific legislation. Specific to fisheries, I think what's missing is a bycatch, accidental catch. Is there a legal framework for this? Again, I think that we need to review and consider this. Having laws, as I said, under the Marine Species Victims Unit introductory slides earlier, we have laws to prevent certain species from being harmed, being killed. Is it sufficient to just say, hey, I prohibit you from doing A? But we need to understand that there needs to be corresponding measures, be it administrative, policy, or management, to actually help negate or avoid any of those incidents from happening. So I've actually given you more than one, but it's thematic. One is in terms of broader ocean governance. Why that's important is with clear delineation when it comes to responsibilities and jurisdiction, can there be true and real accountability? If not, the question would be up in the air. Is it yours? Is it mine? And who becomes accountable and who becomes truly responsible in the face of any adversity or in the face of being accountable? The second was with respect to biodiversity and species in the face and in the wrath of climate change, of depletion of species and ecosystem services. We need to strengthen and we need to actually build a strong framework for the conservation and management of marine biodiversity and species in Malaysia. And thirdly, within the realm of fisheries, definitely we need to enhance the ecosystems approach to fisheries management within the regulatory framework by addressing issues like bycatch, amongst others. I hope that answers your question, Quek.
Yeah, definitely does. Maybe also one last question, because you are going to be a judge and you're going to be looking at the submissions that are going to come in video form and also in written form. What do you expect from these MPPLC participants, Shantini? Maybe you can share a bit of insight.
What do I expect? So I would be looking for a clear problem statement, a clear identification of a problem which persists within the marine environmental realm. So policies and laws shouldn't exist for the sake of existing. They should exist and they have to exist to serve a purpose. So I'll be looking for what that purpose is. Second, having identified a set purpose, a policy or legal intervention being identified needs to correspond and correlate to the set purpose. And in today's world, we can no longer take singular approaches to resolving a problem. We are in a complex and dynamic error where subject matters overlap, and just identifying a single scope may not resolve in a solution. It may actually be more problematic because it creates the false impression, or it glosses over the reality that something is being done when in a real sense, there could be 100 other cracks which could be fracturing the landscape or the fabric of environmental ecosystems and conservation and so forth. So I'll be looking at the approach, the solution, and the purpose. Those would be the three major components that I'll be looking out for.
Okay,
And
that's
all
great.
the very best to all the students. I'm highly, highly excited and enthusiastic to see what recommendations and what problems the students would like to address and present. And thank you very much to Ecology for this great endeavor.
Yeah, and as the committee are very interested to look at what the students sent in. So I think that's all the time we have for Ms. Shantini's session. I hope it was insightful for everyone, learning a little bit about marine policy and marine laws, and I hope it will be used in respective submissions which are due on the 29th of April. So with that, I thank you again, Shantini, for your presentation, and if anything, we will definitely see you in the semifinals. Thank you, Shantini.
Thank you very much, Quek. And my email is there, address is there. If anyone needs to address any further questions, please feel free to email me and I'll address them as and when I can. Thank you so much once again, Quek, for having me. I hope I shed some light on the situation. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you.